Hello Scenesters, this is Movie Review Justin here with another Psychology in Movies video, and today we will be talking about the concept of codependency and featuring Tyler Perry's 2005 film Diary of a Mad Black Woman as our perfect example. That's what we do at Psychology in Movies. We talk about psychology concepts and then find movies to use as examples. So let's get into it. Codependency is a term that was coined in 1986 by a woman named Melody Beattie. It's a term that started getting used in the substance abuse field, and the crux of it is people who stay with people that do not treat them well. Sometimes people get placed in very abusive situations or relationships.
No more hangers!
Normally, our response in these situations is to find a way to escape, leave, or neutralize the situation. But what if we can't or don't want to leave? What if a person just keeps trying harder and harder no matter how abusive a situation is? Sometimes we have no say in what situations we are in, but sometimes people actively choose to stay in situations. When a person is in a relationship where the cost outweigh the benefits, but escaping the relationship would cause too much pain or chaos, and so the person stays, we call this codependency. And we want to stress that there's nothing wrong with being loving or kind, but when things start to negatively impact ourselves and the people around us, that's when it becomes codependency. Codependency is the tendency to let people take advantage of us, meaning especially situations where we are giving a lot, but the other person isn't reciprocating anything at all or not nearly as much back. Situations where we care a lot more about someone than they do about us, and sometimes even situations where we endure mental, emotional, or physical abuse. But codependency is not just the dynamic. It's also a set of maladaptive coping strategies that make things worse. Let's look at a few examples of codependency in Tyler Perry's Diary of a Mad Black Woman, and we will be looking at a few characters that display codependency in the film because there's more than one. Number 1. Over-prioritizing their taker/abuser. Although not all codependents are in relationships with outright abusers, probably the main thing you will notice and the cause of many of the codependence issues is how they will stop at nothing to help, please, or compete over their abuser. They can devote massive amounts of time, energy, money, and resources devoted to people that don't consistently reciprocate. Number 2. Finding abusive people that take advantage of them. Because the codependent is such a giver, often people that manipulate or don't reciprocate find codependents and know that they are people that they can easily exploit. Many codependents have the need to be perfect in order to feel worthy of love, and so narcissistic people can sense this and use this against them to make them more easy to manipulate or control. The codependent might even feel grandiose about this and say or feel things like that this is their quote-unquote mission from God to rescue this other person, or that God is testing their patience, charity, compassion by placing the abuser in their lives when really it is the codependent actively seeking them out. It would be like a person saying that God is testing them with crack cocaine, but the nearest source is 2 hours away. Number 3. Falling into victim/rescuer roles. In 1960, a man named Stephen Cartman came up with the concept of the drama triangle to describe certain relationships like those with codependency. Basically, people fall into one of 3 roles and will naturally alternate as the relationship progresses. Codependents tend to fit the rescuer role and will look for people that need them in order to feel better about themselves. Their logic is that if someone that they love needs them, then they must have intrinsic worth. But the victim, the person that needs love and support, is making themselves feel useless and inferior to avoid responsibility. By having enough excuses or bad things happen to them, they can justify avoiding responsibility and not be seen as a bad person, and the rescuer kind of encourages it. And finally, we have the persecutor, that criticizes and blames others in order to make themselves feel superior. Because the relationship is imbalanced, eventually one or both people will start to blame the other and become the persecutor. When the codependent becomes frustrated by being taken advantage of, they might start viewing the victim as the persecutor, and the codependent becomes a victim themselves. Similarly, whenever the victim feels threatened by the codependent starting to stand up for themselves or pull away or try to hold them accountable, the victim will start to see the rescuer as a persecutor in order to stay the victim. So you see how it can be a big cycle. And people never just stay in their roles. There will always be tons of back and forth and shifting where both people switch roles, but the relationship is never healthy or balanced. Number 4. Distorting reality and manipulating self/others to avoid accountability. Being around abusive people that take us for granted for long periods of time can cause us to start deceiving and manipulating ourselves to help deal with the situation. We might try to remember past happy times or fantasize about future ones. We might look for ways to justify their neglect or abuse, and if this goes on for long enough, it's only a matter of time until we have to openly lie to others in order to protect this false image of our relationships and ourselves. Lying to ourselves is when we constantly give overly generous benefit of the doubt to people proven to be unreliable. The codependent will have a tough time holding other people accountable, and they will have a tough time holding themselves accountable. When they do accept accountability, it will not be in a constructive sense, but more in a victimhood, poor me sense, where they are too broken and helpless to do anything about it. The more extreme the codependency, the more they will distort reality, lie in order to get what they want from people, and create false narratives favorable to the codependent, even if it paints them as a victim, because the codependent would much rather have bad things happen to them than to be a bad person or face any self-accountability. They want to be accountable for other people, but not for themselves. In codependent relationships, people outsource who is in charge of their own best interest or autonomy, and this is a way to avoid accountability. Then if you try to hold codependents accountable, they will just say that you are judging them and start viewing you as a persecutor and themselves as a victim, and then the cycle continues. Number 5. Taking on traits of the abuser. Similar to what we just said, being around narcissistic, psychopathic, or sociopathic people that use you for long periods of time has a tendency to have some of their traits rub off on you. Traits like selfishness, lying, manipulating, using, or even other habits like messiness, becoming neglectful, being late constantly, all of these things can rub off on you if you're in a codependent relationship. Main character Helen takes on quite a lot of Charles's sadistic and hurtful qualities. And earlier in her relationship with Orlando, she is often rude and non-reciprocating and negligent to Orlando's feelings, similar to how Charles was to her. Very early in the movie, Helen alternates with being the rescuer trying to save her marriage, and then back to being the victim when Charles throws her out. When she meets Orlando, she's very judgmental and critical of him, even though he's trying his best to help her. So Helen becomes a persecutor and Orlando becomes a rescuer. Anyway, Orlando becomes a rescuer in order to prove what a good man he is and prove he is trustworthy by allowing Helen to become the victim again. And since Helen is a victim, she can't be held responsible for any of her rude behaviors or suddenly abandoning Orlando at his most vulnerable moment of proposing, to go help Charles instead. She will avoid any accountability of this by playing the victim. And so now she's neglecting Orlando similar to how she was neglected, and he's wanting to prove himself so he can go from being a victim to being a rescuer again. You could say that she's testing him, and I'd say that's exactly right. She's testing to see if he'll put up with the abuse in order to prove his love, similar to how she felt she had to do for Charles. She is being controlling. That is when we micromanage other people out of insecurity. Helen and Orlando are both codependent in this movie, and they both take turns being victims and rescuers all throughout. Helen becomes Charles' rescuer once again, but Charles is abusive, so Helen starts torturing him, and Charles becomes a victim who needs rescue. He apologizes to Helen and basically allows her to embrace and validate her victimhood, so she goes back to rescuing him and helping him walk again. And even the background music romanticizes being attracted to helpless people. But then, when it seems she has Charles back in her life, she leaves him once he no longer needs to be rescued, so she can go rescue Orlando. Do you see how confusing all of this is? The movie ends on a happy note, but it reminds me of the ending of Taxi Driver. When I was younger, I used to think Taxi Driver ended on a happy note and things would work out for Travis Bickle, or for the Travis Bickle character once the movie was over. But similarly with Diary of a Mad Black Woman, I'm not so sure. As long as people fit into these roles of rescuer, victim, and persecutor, people will fall into these abuse patterns and codependency. I don't think it will be happily ever after if things continue and stay the same for Orlando and Helen. I think they will have a relationship that's defining characteristic will be instability and inconsistency. This has been Movie Review Justin at Psychology and Movies. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps the channel grow and reach more people. Thanks for watching and stay healthy and informed.